Australia's musical heritage is in many regards still quite young when compared to many European countries. But what Australia lacks in terms of years, it makes up for in enthusiasm and desire to grow. Music in Australia prior to 1900 was rooted in folk traditions. Folk songs, predominantly sung, detailed the life and times of Australian culture, while still being based around the tunes and ideas carried over from the English traditions brought over by the early English settlers into Australia. Music of Indigenous Australians was present, but mainly within the circles of Indigenous community, with limited influence within the westernised Australian culture. The Commonwealth of Australia was formed in 1901 through the federation of the 6 states under a single constitution. The non-Indigenous population at the time of federation was 3.8 million. Half of these lived in cities, 3/4 were born in Australia, and the majority were of English, Scottish or Irish descent. At the time of Federation, Australian soldiers were fighting in a war as part of the British Empire, the Boer War in South Africa, in which 500 men lost their lives between 1899 and 1902. Australia, although now largely independent as a country, was still very closely tied to the British Empire, and this culture still largely influenced Australia's music's progression. From 1900 to 1914, great progress was made in developing Australia's agricultural and manufacturing capabilities, in setting up institutions of government and social services. Australia was in the early stages of independence from the English way. The First World War had a devastating impact on Australia. In 1914, the male population of Australia was less than 3 million. Yet almost 400,000 of them volunteered to fight in the war. As many as 60,000 died and tens of thousands more were injured. Out of this experience was born one of Australia's most enduring values, the Anzac ethos of courage and spirit. Anzacs stood and still stand for the reckless valour in a good cause, for enterprise, resourcefulness, fidelity, comradeship and endurance that will never be defeated. Opportunities for Australian composers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were limited by demography, economics and variable musical standards. Many important figures such as Arthur Benjamin, Margaret Sutherland, Miriam Hyde and Esther Rofe spent extended periods, if not entire careers, elsewhere. Benjamin, who settled in Britain and later Canada, spent some of the First World War as a prisoner of war. Sadly, Friedrich Septimus Kelly, a promising composer, was killed. Alfred Hill, who studied in Leipzig in the late 1800s, returned to Antipus determined to raise standards. He composed the music for the Federation celebration in 1901, and with Fritz Hart formed Australia's Opera League in 1912 to perform works like A Moorish Maid, the Queen of the Riffs. The same year, colourful Melbourne-based composer George Marshall Hall produced his opera, Stella. Hill was also involved in the foundation of the New South Wales Conservatorium at the time. The period between the two wars was marked with instability. Social and economic divisions widened during the Depression years, with many Australian financial institutions failing. Music on the radio was now a vital part of holding Australia's spirits together. Orchestras in the major cities varied in size, constitution and quality, a situation gradually remedied by the creation of the Australian Broadcasting Commission and its assumption of responsibility over the orchestras in 1930. The ABC established composer competitions in the early 30s, which benefited a number of hopefuls such as Clive Douglas and Miriam Hyde. Roy Agnew's radio broadcasts in the decade seriously raised musical consciousness. Although limited, most of the important music composed for Australia before the 1930s was inevitably for soloist and small forces bands. But there was still a slender yet persistent thread of fine music stretching from the early 20th century to now. There is also a body of attractive works for solo instruments and piano, and for solo voice. Early Australian works for larger ensembles do exist, such as Miriam Hyde's 2 piano concerto, but frequently had their first performances overseas. Musical exploration in Australia can be traced back to the goldfields, where improvisation was a significant part of music in the colonies. Percy Granger, the pianist, composer and collector of folk songs, believed his Australian origin naturally led to innovation and experiment in his music.